October 15, 1944, evening 2000 hours. Somewhere in the Pacific Ocean aboard an American destroyer. A young American sailor named Robert Ellison sat in the radio room, listening to the static and the crackle of radio signals. Suddenly, through the noise, a woman's voice emerged. The voice was smooth, seductive, perfectly accented in American English. The voice belonged to no one the sailor had ever met, and yet it was immediately familiar to every American serviceman who had encountered it. The voice said, "Hello, boys. You're probably wondering where your girlfriends are tonight. Let me tell you, they're probably at home with someone who didn't have to ship off to die in the Pacific. Your girlfriends are probably kissing men who stayed home, men who are safe, men who are making money, while you're here, dying for a government that doesn't care about you." The broadcast continued with music, popular American songs, the kind that homesick sailors craved to hear. But between songs, the voice returned with messages designed to break morale, to create doubt, to make the sailors question their sacrifice. This voice belonged to a woman known to American servicemen as Tokyo Rose. But Tokyo Rose was not a single person. Tokyo Rose was a collective identity, a propaganda persona created by the Japanese military to demoralize American fighting forces. And the most effective voice of Tokyo Rose, the one that American soldiers most feared hearing, belonged to a woman named Iva Toguri. 7,000 miles away in North Africa, another American soldier was tuning his radio late in the evening. Again, through the static, a voice emerged. This voice was also smooth, also perfectly accented in American English. This voice also knew things that only Americans would know. This voice also seduced with promises of home while threatening with messages of doom. This voice belonged to a woman known as Axis Sally. Her real name was Mildred Gillars. She broadcast from Germany to American servicemen in Europe and North Africa, employing the same psychological techniques that Tokyo Rose was using in the Pacific. These two women, operating on opposite sides of the world, working for different enemies, yet employing nearly identical tactics, represented one of the most sophisticated propaganda operations of the Second World War. They represented the attempt by the Axis powers to weaponize psychology itself, to use the power of the female voice to undermine American military morale. This is the story of Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose, two women whose voices became more feared by some American soldiers than enemy artillery. Two women whose broadcasts almost broke American morale. Two women who embodied the question, how far would ordinary people go in service to propaganda, to ideology, and to survival? Propaganda had been used in warfare for centuries. Military leaders had always understood that controlling information and shaping perception could be as important as controlling territory or firepower. But the Second World War introduced something new: electronic propaganda. Radio technology, which had only recently become widespread, offered unprecedented opportunity for propaganda. A voice could be transmitted across vast distances. A voice could reach into military bases, into hospitals, into the homes of civilians. A voice could reach soldiers in combat zones and affect their psychological state. Both the Axis powers and the Allies recognized this opportunity and developed elaborate propaganda operations. The Japanese military established a propaganda unit dedicated to broadcasting to American forces. The goal was to demoralize American soldiers and sailors, to make them question the value of their sacrifice, to make them doubt their government's commitment to them. The German military established a similar operation, targeting American, British, and Canadian forces in Europe and North Africa. What distinguished these propaganda operations from earlier forms of warfare was the sophistication of the psychological techniques employed. The broadcasters understood that simply making threats or directly attacking the enemy would be ineffective. Instead, they used psychological manipulation. They appealed to homesickness, to doubt, to the desire for safety, to sexual anxiety. And crucially, they used female voices. The Axis powers understood something that modern psychologists would later confirm. A female voice could be more effective at psychological manipulation than a male voice. A female voice could convey intimacy and trust. A female voice could appeal to loneliness and sexual desire. A female voice could seem to be an insider, a woman who understood what American soldiers were experiencing because she was American herself, or at least spoke like an American. The result was the creation of propaganda personas that would come to be known to American servicemen as Tokyo Rose in the Pacific and Axis Sally in Europe and North Africa. Mildred Gillars was born in Portland, Maine in 1900. She was a talented musician and actress. In the 1930s, she had dreams of becoming a performer. She moved to Germany in 1934, ostensibly to pursue her musical career. She worked as an actress and performer in Berlin during the late 1930s, a time when the Nazi regime was consolidating power and beginning the systematic persecution of Jews. The exact circumstances under which Gillars became involved in Nazi propaganda broadcasting remain historically unclear. Some accounts suggest that she was coerced into the work. Others suggest that she willingly participated, attracted by the pay and the opportunity to maintain a performing career even as the war made normal entertainment work impossible. What is clear is that by 1941, Mildred Gillars had become one of the primary voices of Nazi propaganda directed at American servicemen. She took the stage name Axis Sally and began broadcasting from German radio stations. Her broadcasts were designed to be directed at American forces, and she carefully crafted her persona to appeal to American soldiers' emotions and vulnerabilities. She spoke perfect American English with no trace of an accent. She demonstrated intimate knowledge of American popular culture, American slang, American concerns. She referenced specific American cities, specific American military units, specific American commanders. This attention to detail gave her broadcasts an air of authenticity and credibility that made them more effective at psychological manipulation. More importantly, Gillars understood the psychology of the soldier. She knew that soldiers were far from home. She knew that they were afraid. She knew that they were uncertain about whether their sacrifice would be rewarded or recognized. She knew that they missed their families, their girlfriends, their homes, and she exploited all of this with a voice that was simultaneously seductive and threatening. A transcription of one of her broadcasts, preserved in American military archives, captures her psychological approach. "Hello, my dear American friends. I'm speaking to you this evening from Berlin, where the weather is lovely, where the nightclubs are full of beautiful women, where life goes on. You know what they're doing tonight in your hometown? I'll tell you. Your girlfriend is probably going out dancing with some American man who had the good sense to stay home. Your wife is probably filing for divorce because she can't wait forever for a man who may never come home. Your job is probably being filled by someone else. Your place in your community is probably being taken by someone who didn't have to die for his country. And why? Why are you there? What is your government giving you in exchange for your youth, your health, your life? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. But the German people appreciate sacrifice. The German people honor those who serve. You could surrender. You could be safe. You could live. But instead, your government wants you to die in this pointless war." The appeal was sophisticated. It was not simply attacking the enemy. It was creating doubt about the purpose of the sacrifice, about the gratitude of the home nation, about the prospects for survival and reunion with loved ones. Iva Toguri was born in Los Angeles in 1916. She was a nisei, a second-generation Japanese American. Unlike many Japanese Americans who had been imprisoned in internment camps after Pearl Harbor, Iva Toguri had been in Japan when the war began. She had been visiting Japan in late 1941, expecting to return to America after a brief visit. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and America declared war, she was trapped in enemy territory. Iva Toguri remained in Japan for the duration of the war, essentially a prisoner in all but name. She was an American citizen stranded in enemy territory, unable to return home, uncertain of her future. In 1942, the Japanese military discovered Toguri's linguistic abilities. She spoke fluent English with a perfect American accent. She was American-born and could understand American culture and psychology. She was essentially exactly what the Japanese propaganda effort needed. Toguri was approached about working for the Japanese propaganda operation. The exact circumstances of her recruitment remain historically contested. Some accounts suggest she was coerced or threatened. Other accounts suggest that she accepted the work willingly, seeing it as a way to ensure her survival in Japan and perhaps eventually make her way home. What is clear is that by 1943, Iva Toguri had become one of the primary voices of the propaganda broadcasts known to American servicemen as Tokyo Rose. She joined other women broadcasters in creating propaganda content designed to demoralize American servicemen in the Pacific. She became particularly famous for broadcasts that used specific information about American military units, naval operations, and military casualties to create the impression that the Japanese had extraordinary intelligence capabilities and that American military operations were being systematically defeated. A transcription of one of Toguri's broadcasts, captured by American intelligence, demonstrates her sophisticated psychological approach. Good evening, American servicemen. This is your favorite program, brought to you by the Japanese Defense Ministry. Tonight, I'm speaking to the men of the 7th Marine Division, currently operating in the Gilbert Islands. I know you're worried about your families at home. I know you're wondering if anyone is remembering you, if anyone still cares about the sacrifices you're making. Well, let me tell you what's happening at home while you're here dying for nothing. Your wives are remarrying. Your girlfriends are having babies with men who had the intelligence to stay home. Your jobs are being taken by people who didn't have to die for their country. Your children will grow up not knowing their fathers. Japan respects sacrifice. Japan honors those who fight. But America sends you here to die for rubber trees in the jungle. America doesn't care about you. Japan would treat you with honor if you surrendered. Like Axis Sally, Toguri understood the psychology of the soldier. She knew about homesickness, about doubt, about fear. And she weaponized that knowledge with a voice that was impossible to dismiss because it spoke with authentic American accents, authentic American references, authentic American understanding. From a military perspective, what made Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose so effective was not their factual claims. Soldiers understood that they were listening to enemy propaganda. Soldiers understood that the broadcasters were lying, that they were trying to break morale. But the effectiveness of propaganda often depends not on factual accuracy but on psychological resonance. The broadcasts were effective because they spoke to genuine fears, genuine doubts, genuine emotional vulnerabilities that every soldier carried. A soldier might intellectually understand that his girlfriend wasn't abandoning him, that his job wasn't being permanently taken, that his government cared about him. But emotionally, listening to a seductive female voice suggest these things, the doubts would creep in. The certainties would become uncertain. American military psychologists studied the broadcasts and their effects on morale. Their conclusions were clear. The broadcasts were having a measurable negative impact on soldier morale, particularly among soldiers who were already struggling with homesickness, fatigue, or the stress of combat. Worse, the broadcasts were having effects that extended beyond morale. Some soldiers reported difficulty sleeping after listening to the broadcasts. Some reported anxiety and depression. Some reported that the broadcasts crystallized doubts and fears that they had been trying to suppress. One American intelligence officer, analyzing the psychological impact of the broadcasts, wrote, "The enemy has developed a sophisticated weapon that operates not through physical force but through psychological manipulation. The broadcasts specifically target the emotional vulnerabilities of our soldiers. They appeal to loneliness, to sexual anxiety, to doubt about the government's commitment, to fear of death. They are, in many respects, more dangerous than artillery because they attack the psychological foundations that sustain soldiers through combat." The American military responded to the threat of the broadcasts by issuing orders that soldiers should not listen to them. But this order was essentially ineffective. Soldiers, desperately homesick and craving any contact with home, continued to listen to the broadcasts even while understanding that they were meant to break morale. One of the most remarkable aspects of Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose's broadcasts was their apparent knowledge of American military operations. The broadcasts would reference specific American military units by name. They would reference recent American casualties. They would reference American military strategy and plans. This detailed knowledge suggested that the Axis powers had extraordinary intelligence capabilities and that American military operations were being systematically compromised. In fact, the actual source of this information was far less impressive than it seemed. Much of the detailed information used in the broadcasts came from American newspapers, American radio broadcasts, and other publicly available sources. The broadcasters were remarkably adept at collecting publicly available information and presenting it in ways that made it seem like secret intelligence. But soldiers listening to the broadcasts often didn't know this. Soldiers heard detailed information about their own units, their own operations, and assumed that the enemy must have penetrated American security. This assumption itself was damaging to morale. Soldiers wondered if they were fighting against an enemy that had superior intelligence capabilities. American military intelligence spent significant resources trying to determine how Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose were obtaining their detailed information. Only gradually did it become clear that the information was coming from public sources, from careless references in newspapers, from information available to anyone who was paying attention to American media. This realization was, in a sense, even more damaging to morale than the alternative would have been. It meant that American operational security was being compromised not by Japanese espionage or Nazi spies, but by American newspapers and American media that were publishing information that the military considered sensitive. American military command recognized the threat posed by Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose and attempted to develop countermeasures. One approach was to broadcast counterpropaganda aimed at American servicemen, reminding them of home, of the progress of the war, of the reasons they were fighting. The American military established radio programs designed to compete with the morale-breaking effects of Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose. Another approach was to attempt to intercept and jam the broadcasts. American military intelligence worked to identify the exact frequencies on which the broadcasts were being transmitted and to jam those frequencies to prevent reception. But jamming was only partially effective, and determined soldiers could often receive the broadcasts by tuning to slightly different frequencies. A third approach was to issue explicit orders that soldiers should not listen to the broadcasts. Officers were ordered to discourage soldiers from listening and to remove radios from areas where soldiers congregated. But this approach was also only partially effective. Soldiers who desperately wanted to hear any voice from home, even if that voice was the enemy, continued to find ways to listen. Perhaps the most effective counterpropaganda approach was to acknowledge the reality of what soldiers were experiencing, to acknowledge that it was normal to feel homesick, to feel doubt, to miss home, and to provide alternative sources of support and information. The American military also attempted a novel approach. They tried to identify who Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose actually were, and they attempted to contact them, sometimes through neutral countries like Sweden or Switzerland. The goal was to potentially convince them to stop broadcasting or even to defect to the American side. These approaches had limited success. Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose continued broadcasting throughout most of the war. Their voices remained a presence in the emotional and psychological landscape of American servicemen. As months and then years passed, American servicemen began to develop a kind of relationship with the voices they were hearing. Soldiers began to speculate about who Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose actually were. They gave them nicknames. They developed fantasies about them. In some cases, soldiers became almost attracted to the women whose voices they were hearing, despite understanding that those voices were meant to demoralize them. This phenomenon, soldiers developing emotional attachments to the propaganda broadcasters, was itself a form of psychological danger. The broadcasters were becoming more than just voices transmitting propaganda. They were becoming characters, personalities, figures that soldiers thought about and discussed. The American military attempted to combat this by providing soldiers with information about who the broadcasters actually were. American intelligence services attempted to determine the actual identities of Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose and to publicize that information to soldiers. For Axis Sally, intelligence officers eventually determined that the primary voice was that of Mildred Gillars, an American woman from Maine who had somehow ended up in Nazi Germany. This information was publicized in American newspapers and in military briefings. But knowing Gillars's actual identity did not particularly diminish the psychological effectiveness of her broadcasts. If anything, knowing that an actual American woman was voluntarily working for the Nazis created additional emotional confusion for American servicemen. For Tokyo Rose, the situation was more complex because Tokyo Rose was not a single person but rather a collective identity. Multiple women had broadcast under the Tokyo Rose name or had been called Tokyo Rose by American servicemen. American intelligence had difficulty determining which broadcasts came from which women. Over time, intelligence services came to believe that Iva Toguri was one of the primary voices of Tokyo Rose. But confirming this identity was difficult, and the question of whether Toguri had been coerced into the broadcasts or had voluntarily participated remained unclear. As the war progressed and military victories began to shift clearly in favor of the Allies, both Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose faced a question that would eventually become urgent. What would happen to them after the war ended? If the Axis powers were defeated, propaganda broadcasters who had worked for the enemy would be captured. They would face trials for treason and collaboration with the enemy. They would potentially face severe punishment. This knowledge affected how the broadcasters approached their work. Some accounts suggest that both Gillars and Toguri attempted to modify their broadcasts toward the end of the war, making them less vicious and less demoralizing. Some accounts suggest that they attempted to gather evidence that they had been coerced into their work, that they had not volunteered but had been forced to broadcast at gunpoint or under threat. The historical evidence on this point is mixed and contested. Some testimony suggests that both Gillars and Toguri had opportunities to refuse the work and chose not to. Other testimony suggests that they faced genuine coercion and had no real choice in the matter. The ambiguity of this question, the difficulty of determining whether they were willing collaborators or coerced participants, would haunt the post-war trials of both women. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, Mildred Gillars disappeared. She went into hiding using false identity papers, attempting to avoid capture by Allied forces. For months, her whereabouts were unknown. American military intelligence searched for her, but Gillars had effectively vanished into the chaos of post-war Germany. American servicemen, many of whom had listened to her broadcasts and developed strong emotional reactions to her voice, were left wondering what had happened to her. Some hoped she had escaped. Others hoped she would be captured and punished. In the Pacific, when Japan surrendered in August 1945, Iva Toguri also faced immediate danger. American forces were occupying Japan. American military authorities were searching for propaganda broadcasters. Toguri, like Gillars, attempted to hide her identity and avoid capture. But Toguri was eventually identified. An American correspondent in Japan discovered that Toguri was alive and located in Tokyo. The correspondent contacted American military authorities. Toguri was arrested and detained by American military forces. Mildred Gillars was eventually captured in 1946. She was arrested and brought back to the United States to stand trial. Gillars was charged with treason against the United States. The charge was serious. Treason was one of the most severe crimes that could be charged. If convicted, Gillars faced a potential death sentence. The trial of Mildred Gillars became a significant legal and public event in post-war America. The trial raised questions about the nature of propaganda, about the responsibility of American citizens who had worked for the enemy, about the distinction between coercion and voluntary collaboration. Gillars' defense was that she had been coerced into the broadcasts. She testified that she had feared for her life if she refused to participate. She testified that Nazi officials had threatened her with death or imprisonment if she would not broadcast. Prosecutors argued that Gillars had been an active and willing participant. They presented evidence that she had continued broadcasting even after it became clear that Germany was losing the war. They presented evidence that her broadcasts had been sophisticated and well-crafted, suggesting a willing propagandist rather than a reluctant conscript. The trial lasted weeks. Testimony was presented from American servicemen who had listened to her broadcasts and who described the psychological impact. Testimony was presented from intelligence officers who had monitored her broadcasts and who described her techniques. Ultimately, Gillars was convicted of treason. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison. Iva Toguri faced a different legal situation. When she was captured in Japan, American authorities initially planned to prosecute her for treason. But the case was complicated by several factors. Toguri was an American citizen, but she had been stranded in Japan when the war began, and the circumstances of her participation in the broadcasts remained unclear. American military authorities held Toguri for several months while they investigated her case and determined how to proceed. During this time, American public opinion began to shift. Some people argued that Toguri had been a victim of circumstance, trapped in Japan and forced to work for the Japanese military. Others argued that she had been a willing propagandist who had actively worked to demoralize American soldiers. Toguri was eventually released from American military custody in 1946 and returned to civilian status. The military decided not to prosecute her for treason, but Toguri's legal troubles were far from over. In 1948, based partly on testimony from other women who had worked in Tokyo Rose broadcasts, Iva Toguri was arrested and brought back to trial. This time, Toguri was charged with treason in a civilian court. The trial became one of the most controversial treason trials in American history. The prosecution's case rested on the argument that Toguri had made propaganda broadcasts designed to demoralize American military forces, and that these broadcasts constituted treason against the United States. Toguri's defense was that she had not been the primary Tokyo Rose voice, that other women had made the most damaging broadcasts, and that she had been coerced into participating and had attempted to minimize the damage of her broadcasts. The trial became a complex examination of who exactly Tokyo Rose was and whether Toguri's participation in the broadcasts constituted treason. Ultimately, Toguri was convicted of one count of treason. She was sentenced to 10 years in prison. But the conviction was controversial. Many observers felt that Toguri had been unfairly blamed for broadcasts that may have been made by other women. Many observers felt that the prosecution had not proven that Toguri's broadcasts specifically caused identifiable damage to American military operations or morale. The trials and convictions of Mildred Gillars and Iva Toguri marked the end of their lives as they had known them, but the controversies surrounding their cases continued for decades. Mildred Gillars was released from prison after serving approximately 12 years. She lived a quiet life for the remainder of her years, attempting to avoid publicity. She died in 1965, taking with her many questions about the exact nature of her cooperation with the Nazis and the degree to which she had been coerced versus willing. Iva Toguri's case proved more controversial and more legally complicated. She served 6 years of her 10-year sentence before her conviction was challenged on appeal. Her legal case became a focal point for broader questions about the nature of treason, about the definition of propaganda, and about American citizenship and loyalty. Toguri's conviction was appealed repeatedly over the years. Legal scholars, historians, and Japanese-American civil rights activists argued that the conviction was unjust, that Toguri had been a victim of circumstance and coercion, and that she had been unfairly blamed for the broadcasts of other women. In 1977, President Gerald Ford granted Toguri a presidential pardon, essentially acknowledging that the conviction may have been unjust. Toguri was released from prison and lived the remainder of her life attempting to rebuild after decades of legal troubles and imprisonment. The trials and convictions of Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose raised fundamental questions about justice that remain relevant today. Was it just to prosecute and imprison women who had worked for the enemy, if those women had been coerced or trapped by circumstances beyond their control? On the other hand, was it just to allow women who had actively participated in propaganda designed to demoralize American soldiers to escape without punishment? The answer to these questions depends partly on the specific circumstances of each woman. Gillars appeared to have been more actively willing than Toguri. Toguri appeared to have been more trapped by circumstance than Gillars. But the historical evidence remains incomplete, and the question of exactly what coercion or voluntary choice was involved remains contested. More broadly, the trials raised questions about the definition of treason and the nature of propaganda in wartime. Was propaganda itself an act of war, deserving of legal punishment? Or was propaganda simply a less lethal form of violence that soldiers were expected to endure? American legal tradition held that propaganda, however demoralizing, was not sufficient grounds for a treason conviction if the propagandist had not actively aided the military operations of the enemy. But the trials of Gillars and Toguri seem to blur this distinction, treating their broadcasts as if they constituted active aid to the enemy. Decades after the war ended, American veterans who had listened to Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose broadcasts were interviewed about their experiences. Their memories were vivid and often emotionally charged. Many veterans recalled being deeply affected by the broadcasts. Some recalled anger at the propagandists. Others recalled a kind of morbid fascination with the voices they were hearing. One veteran, who had served in the Pacific, recalled, "We all listened to Tokyo Rose broadcasts. We told ourselves we were listening to get intelligence information, to learn what the Japanese were planning. But the truth was we listened because we were homesick and lonely. Tokyo Rose spoke in American English. Tokyo Rose seemed to understand what we were experiencing. And in a twisted way, listening to her voice made us feel less alone, even though she was trying to break our morale. When I learned after the war that Tokyo Rose had been a real person, an American woman named Iva Toguri, I felt conflicted. Part of me was angry at her for what she had done. Part of me felt sympathetic to her. I wondered how she had ended up in that situation, how an American woman had ended up working for the Japanese. When I learned that she had been convicted of treason and imprisoned for 6 years, I wasn't entirely sure how I felt. It seemed like justice, but it also seemed like it might be more complicated than that. Another veteran who had served in Europe and listened to Axis Sally broadcasts recalled, Axis Sally's broadcasts were incredibly psychologically sophisticated. She knew how to appeal to our fears and our doubts. Listening to her voice, it was easy to forget that we were fighting for something important, for something righteous. She made it seem like we were just pawns, sacrificed by a government that didn't care about us. I don't know if her broadcasts actually broke anyone's morale in a permanent way, but I know that for the time you were listening to her, she made you doubt. She made you wonder, and that doubt, even temporary doubt, was a kind of victory for the enemy. The broadcasts of Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose represent an early example of psychological warfare conducted through mass media. The broadcasters understood that modern warfare was not simply about military strength and firepower. It was also about psychological states, about morale, about the mental and emotional condition of soldiers. They understood that if they could demoralize soldiers, if they could create doubt and fear, they could weaken the enemy's fighting effectiveness without firing a shot. The approach was sophisticated and in many respects ahead of its time. The broadcasters anticipated modern psychological operations and modern propaganda techniques by several decades. In subsequent conflicts, military and intelligence organizations would develop increasingly sophisticated psychological operations. The techniques developed during the Second World War, including the use of radio broadcasts to demoralize enemy forces, would be refined and expanded in later conflicts. But the legacy of Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose is also a warning. It is a warning about how propaganda can be weaponized. It is a warning about how the female voice can be used as a tool of manipulation. It is a warning about how ordinary people can become tools of propaganda systems, either willingly or through coercion. The story of Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose raises profound moral questions that extend beyond the specific historical circumstances. First, there is the question of personal responsibility. To what extent are individuals responsible for their participation in propaganda systems? If Mildred Gillars and Iva Toguri had been coerced into their work, does that reduce their moral responsibility for the broadcasts? Or does participation in propaganda designed to demoralize enemy soldiers constitute a moral wrong regardless of the degree of coercion involved? Second, there is the question of the responsibility of the nation-state. To what extent were Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan responsible for the propaganda broadcasts? To what extent can they be held accountable for using their own citizens as tools of psychological warfare? Third, there is the question of the responsibility of the listener. American soldiers who listened to the broadcasts were making a choice to listen, a choice to be affected, a choice to allow the propaganda to influence their thinking. To what extent are soldiers responsible for their own psychological reactions to propaganda? Fourth, there is the question of the responsibility of society. American society prosecuted Gillars and Toguri for their participation in propaganda broadcasts, but American society itself had used women's voices as propaganda tools. American military broadcasters also targeted enemy soldiers with psychological messages designed to demoralize them. Is there a moral distinction between using propaganda against enemies and using propaganda against one's own soldiers? These questions do not have simple answers. The moral complexity of propaganda and psychological warfare extends far beyond the specific cases of Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose. In the decades after the war, American understanding of Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose evolved significantly. In the immediate post-war period, the broadcasters were often understood as straightforward villains, American women who had betrayed their country by working for the enemy. This narrative was reinforced by the trials and convictions. But as decades passed and more historical research was conducted, a more nuanced understanding emerged. Historians and scholars began to examine the circumstances that had led Gillars and Toguri to become propaganda broadcasters. They began to examine the degree of coercion versus voluntary choice involved in their participation. They began to question whether prosecution and imprisonment were appropriate responses to propaganda work. By the 1970s and 1980s, when presidential pardon was granted to Toguri, public opinion had shifted significantly. Many Americans began to view Toguri not primarily as a traitor but as a victim of circumstance, an American woman who had been stranded in enemy territory and had been coerced into working for the enemy government. This shift in understanding reflected broader changes in American attitudes toward women, toward propaganda, toward the nature of coercion and choice, and toward the responsibility of individuals operating within totalitarian systems. When we listen today to recordings of broadcasts by Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose, recordings that have been preserved in military archives and historical collections, what emerges is a portrait of two women who understood the psychological vulnerabilities of soldiers and who exploited those vulnerabilities with remarkable effectiveness. But what also emerges is a portrait of two women who may have been more victims of their circumstances than villains in a straightforward sense. Mildred Gillars was an American woman who had pursued a career in entertainment and who had ended up in Nazi Germany during one of history's most cataclysmic wars. She had worked for the Nazis, creating propaganda designed to demoralize enemy soldiers. Whether she had chosen this work or been coerced into it, the result was the same. She participated in psychological warfare against American soldiers. Iva Toguri was an American citizen who had been stranded in enemy territory when war broke out. She had been forced to work for the Japanese military or face imprisonment or execution. She had created propaganda broadcasts designed to demoralize American soldiers. Whether she had tried to minimize her participation or had been unable to prevent her involvement, the result was the same. She participated in psychological warfare against American soldiers. In both cases, the question of moral responsibility remains complex and contested. One of the most interesting aspects of the broadcasts of Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose is not what the broadcasters said, but how American soldiers responded to what they heard. Soldiers who listened to the broadcasts often felt compelled to listen repeatedly, even while recognizing that the broadcasts were meant to demoralize them. Soldiers who had never met Axis Sally or Tokyo Rose developed emotional attachments to their voices. Soldiers who intellectually understood that the broadcasts were propaganda still found themselves emotionally affected by what they heard. This response reveals something important about human psychology and the nature of propaganda. Propaganda is not simply a matter of presenting factual claims that listeners can evaluate rationally. Propaganda works at an emotional and psychological level that often bypasses rational evaluation. A soldier who understood perfectly well that Tokyo Rose was lying about his girlfriend abandoning him could still feel a moment of doubt and fear when hearing her describe the scenario in that seductive voice. The emotional impact could coexist with intellectual understanding. This is why propaganda broadcasters like Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose were effective. They were not trying to convince soldiers of new facts. They were trying to amplify existing fears and doubts, to give voice to existing anxieties, to make soldiers feel that their fears were validated by an outside source. In military archives and historical collections, recordings of actual broadcasts by Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose have been preserved. Listening to these recordings decades later, what emerges is a portrait of psychological sophistication combined with emotional manipulation. One preserved recording of Axis Sally begins with American popular music, the kind of music soldiers crave to hear from home. Then her voice emerges, smooth and seductive. "Hello, fellas. You recognize this song? This is Mood Indigo by Duke Ellington. It was popular back in the States about 3 years ago. 3 years. That's how long you've been away from home. That's how long your girlfriend has been waiting for you. Or has she? Let me tell you what really happens when American servicemen are away at war. The sophistication lies not in any individual claim, but in the accumulated effect of appealing to specific emotions, referencing specific cultural touchstones, and creating an intimate tone that makes the listener feel understood and valued while simultaneously undermining his certainties." A preserved recording of Tokyo Rose, directed at sailors of the Pacific Fleet, demonstrates a different but equally sophisticated approach. Good evening, American sailors. This is your Tokyo Rose speaking to you from the Imperial Japanese Navy headquarters. I have some sad news for you tonight. The USS Yorktown has been sunk. Yes, your fellow sailors are dead. 2,000 of them gone. And why? For what? So that your government can steal Japanese territory? So that America can dominate the Pacific? These young men are dying. And for what purpose? The claim about the USS Yorktown would often be accurate. Tokyo Rose would broadcast information about American ship losses, sometimes before official confirmation had been released to the American public. This accuracy made the broadcast seem credible and made soldiers believe that the Japanese had extraordinary intelligence capabilities. But the real power of the broadcasts lay not in the accuracy of the information but in the psychological framing. The broadcasts did not simply report facts. They interpreted those facts in ways designed to undermine soldiers' confidence in their leadership, in the purpose of the war, and in the likelihood of survival. Military historians have long debated whether the broadcasts of Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose had any measurable impact on military operations. From one perspective, the impact appears to have been marginal. American military operations continued. American soldiers continued to fight. American victories continued to accumulate. The broadcasts did not cause mass desertions. They did not cause mutinies. They did not prevent American military victories. From another perspective, however, the impact was significant. Military morale is a measurable factor in military effectiveness. Soldiers with lower morale are less effective in combat. Soldiers with lower morale are more likely to be wounded or killed because they are not fully focused on their tactical situation. Soldiers with lower morale are more likely to make mistakes, to freeze in critical situations, to fail to support their comrades effectively. American military medical personnel reported that soldiers affected by the broadcasts sometimes presented with psychological symptoms, anxiety, depression, difficulty sleeping, that affected their ability to function in combat. American military chaplains reported that soldiers suffering from homesickness and doubt sought them out, creating a significant burden on military medical and spiritual resources. One American military psychologist, analyzing the impact of the broadcasts, estimated that the psychological effects of the broadcasts resulted in measurable reduction in military effectiveness, though the psychologist was careful to note that this reduction was marginal compared to the overall military effectiveness of American forces. The broadcasts were not decisive in any single battle or campaign, but accumulated across the thousands of soldiers who heard them, across the months and years of psychological pressure. The broadcasts had some measurable negative impact on American military morale and effectiveness. An interesting aspect of the broadcasts is that their effectiveness varied depending on the psychological state of the listener. Soldiers who were confident, who had strong ties to home, who believed in the cause of the war, who had good morale within their unit, these soldiers were largely immune to the broadcasts. They might listen out of curiosity, but the broadcasts did not significantly affect their psychological state or their commitment to military service. But soldiers who were homesick, who were doubtful about the war, who were afraid, who were isolated from their unit, these soldiers were significantly affected by the broadcasts. For these soldiers, the broadcasts seemed to validate their existing fears and doubts. The broadcasts seemed to offer an external voice confirming their internal anxieties. This pattern reveals something important about propaganda. Propaganda is most effective when it is preaching to the psychologically vulnerable. Propaganda works by amplifying existing doubts and fears, not by creating entirely new beliefs. From this perspective, the broadcasts of Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose were most effective not because they convinced soldiers of new facts, but because they amplified existing anxieties that soldiers were already experiencing. For a homesick soldier already wondering whether his girlfriend was faithful, Tokyo Rose's suggestions about her infidelity would have a much greater impact than the same suggestion would have on a soldier with secure family ties and high confidence in his relationships. The broadcasters understood this. They specifically targeted soldiers who were most psychologically vulnerable. They specifically appealed to the most common anxieties and fears among soldiers. They created broadcasts designed to amplify existing doubts rather than to create new ones. One reason the broadcasts did not have more dramatic effects on American military operations is that military discipline and military structure provided a countervailing force against the demoralizing effects of the propaganda. Soldiers were part of units. Soldiers had comrades who depended on them. Soldiers had officers who provided leadership and maintained unit cohesion. When a soldier heard Tokyo Rose's broadcast suggesting that the war was hopeless and that surrender was preferable to continued fighting, the soldier was embedded in a unit structure that counteracted that message. The soldier's unit commander was telling him to continue fighting. His comrades were depending on him. His training had prepared him for psychological pressure. His military discipline required him to maintain his commitment to the mission. This military structure meant that even if the broadcasts had psychological effects on individual soldiers, those effects were constrained and limited by the broader military framework within which soldiers operated. American military command understood this and deliberately used military structure, unit cohesion, and military discipline as countermeasures to the demoralizing effects of enemy propaganda. After the war ended, American military intelligence conducted extensive investigations into the broadcasts of Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose. These investigations examined multiple questions. Who exactly had made the broadcasts? How many women had broadcast as Tokyo Rose? What had been the intended psychological effects? How effective had the broadcasts actually been? For Axis Sally, the investigation was relatively straightforward. Mildred Gillars was identified as one of the primary voices of Axis Sally. Intelligence officers determined that Gillars had been in Berlin during the entire period of the broadcasts, and that voice analysis suggested that the broadcasts attributed to Axis Sally matched Gillars's voice. For Tokyo Rose, the investigation was more complex. American intelligence determined that multiple women had broadcast as Tokyo Rose. The broadcasts attributed to Tokyo Rose did not all come from a single individual. But one woman, Iva Toguri, appeared to have been one of the more prominent voices of Tokyo Rose. This complexity in the Tokyo Rose investigation would later complicate legal proceedings against Toguri. If Tokyo Rose was not a single person but a collective identity shared by multiple women, then the question of Toguri's individual responsibility became more complicated. In American popular culture and memory, the broadcasts of Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose became legendary. Soldiers who had experienced the war spoke about Tokyo Rose with a mixture of fear, fascination, and resentment. Popular music, films, and literature referenced Tokyo Rose and Axis Sally. The broadcasts became symbols of enemy propaganda and psychological warfare. They became examples of how modern media could be weaponized for military purposes. But as decades passed, cultural memory of the broadcasts began to change. Instead of being remembered primarily as villainous propaganda, the broadcasts came to be understood as historical artifacts that revealed something about the nature of war, about propaganda, about psychological manipulation, and about gender roles in wartime. Scholars began to study the broadcasts not as enemy propaganda to be feared, but as historical documents that revealed how propaganda worked, how psychological manipulation functioned, and how ordinary people could be drawn into participating in systems of propaganda and control. One of the most interesting questions raised by the history of Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose is the question of agency. To what extent were these women agents of their own choices, and to what extent were they agents of the systems that controlled them? Mildred Gillars was a woman living in Nazi Germany. Could she have refused to work for the Nazi propaganda apparatus? What would have been the consequences? Would she have been imprisoned, executed, or would the Nazis simply have found someone else to do the work? Iva Toguri was a woman stranded in enemy territory. Could she have refused to work for the Japanese propaganda apparatus? What would have been the consequences? Would she have been imprisoned, forced into sexual slavery, executed as a suspected spy? The historical evidence is incomplete, and the question of what alternatives were actually available to both women remains contested. But the broader question of agency is important. In a totalitarian system, in a system of propaganda and control, to what extent can ordinary individuals be held responsible for their participation in that system? At what point does coercion become sufficient to eliminate moral responsibility? These are not simple questions, and different people answer them differently depending on their understanding of morality, responsibility, and the human capacity to resist systemic coercion. In the 21st century, decades after the war ended and after the deaths of most of the principal figures involved, the broadcasts of Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose can be heard on the internet, in historical archives, and in documentary films. Listening to these broadcasts today, what emerges is a portrait of historical moment when nations attempted to weaponize communication technology in service of psychological warfare. The broadcasts reveal the sophistication of propaganda techniques. The broadcasts reveal how gender, voice, and intimacy can be used as tools of psychological manipulation. The broadcasts reveal how accurate information combined with psychological framing can create powerful effects on listeners. But the broadcasts also reveal the humanity of the broadcasters. In the voices of Mildred Gillars and Iva Toguri, what emerges is not simply villainy or treachery. What emerges is complexity. Women navigating impossible circumstances, women participating in systems they may not have chosen, women whose actions had consequences they may not have fully understood or intended. The history of Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose offers lessons that remain relevant to understanding modern propaganda and psychological warfare. First, propaganda is most effective when it appeals to existing fears and doubts rather than when it attempts to create entirely new beliefs. The broadcasts of Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose were effective not because they convinced soldiers of facts they didn't already believe, but because they amplified anxieties and fears that soldiers were already experiencing. Second, the female voice has particular power in psychological and propaganda contexts. A female voice can convey intimacy, understanding, and connection in ways that a male voice cannot. The use of female voices in propaganda is a sophisticated technique that remains relevant to understanding modern propaganda. Third, accurate information combined with psychological framing can create powerful propaganda effects. The broadcasts of Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose often contained accurate information, but the information was framed in ways designed to undermine morale and confidence. This combination of accuracy and psychological framing made the broadcasts more effective than propaganda that was entirely false would have been. Fourth, military discipline and unit cohesion serve as countermeasures to psychological propaganda. Individual soldiers exposed to propaganda may have psychological effects, but soldiers embedded in cohesive units with strong leadership and clear mission are more resistant to the demoralizing effects of propaganda. Fifth, propaganda broadcasters themselves may be victims as much as perpetrators. The history of Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose reveals that propagandists are often trapped in systems of control and may have limited agency in their participation. This does not eliminate responsibility, but it complicates the straightforward narrative of villains deliberately spreading propaganda. When we tally the costs and consequences of the propaganda broadcasts of Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose, what emerges is a complex historical balance sheet. On one side, the broadcasts had measurable negative effects on American military morale. The broadcasts affected individual soldiers' psychological states. The broadcasts created anxiety, doubt, and fear. The broadcasts contributed to the burden on American military medical and psychological services. On the other side, the broadcasts had only marginal effects on American military operations and effectiveness. American forces continued to advance. American victories continued to accumulate. The broadcasts did not prevent American victory or significantly delay it. For Mildred Gillars and Iva Toguri, the consequences were severe and lasting. Both women faced criminal prosecution. Both women were convicted and imprisoned. Both women spent years in prison for their participation in propaganda broadcasts. Both women emerged from prison to find that they had been profoundly changed by their experiences and by the stigma attached to their names. For the American soldiers who listened to the broadcasts, the consequences were more variable. Some soldiers were significantly affected, carrying psychological wounds for the rest of their lives. Other soldiers were largely unaffected, able to listen to the broadcasts with intellectual distance and emotional detachment. In 1965, Mildred Gillars died in her 70s, after spending the remainder of her life attempting to move beyond her role as Axis Sally. She had never fully escaped the stigma attached to that role. In 1990, Iva Toguri died in her 70s, after living decades in relative obscurity following her presidential pardon. She had spent much of her later life attempting to restore her reputation and to help people understand the circumstances under which she had been forced to work for the Japanese military. The voices of Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose are now historical artifacts. They are no longer fresh presences in the emotional and psychological landscape of living soldiers. They exist now only in recordings, in historical documents, in memories of aging veterans, and in historical scholarship. But the broadcasts remain significant as examples of how propaganda works, how psychological warfare can be conducted, how ordinary people can be drawn into systems of propaganda and control, and how the line between agency and coercion, between perpetration and victimization, can be complex and contested. The broadcasts of Axis Sally and Tokyo Rose ultimately teach lessons about the nature of communication, influence, and the psychological dimensions of warfare that remain relevant to understanding both the Second World War and the nature of modern conflicts and propaganda operations. The voices may fade, but the lessons they teach persist.